details on something, go ahead and ask those, but let's refrain from doing anything on your specific scenarios until afterwards, and I always plan on hanging out after, so. Can you guys hear me okay?
Perfect. So write your questions
That's all right.
down, same for the.
Not sure if the mic's picking that up or not. All right. Okay. I listen to my voice all the time, so it drowns into the background. Okay, so my name is Christian Bryant. I've owned my own management company for going on about 11 years now. Started it after the wonderful recession in 2008, which I was a account executive for one of the banks and mostly did commercial lending and stuff like that. Luckily, I got a nice severance package because we had a parent company that didn't want to end up in the news media. And so from there, I actually partnered with the owner of Coldwell Banker Mountain West Real Estate down in Salem and started a management company down there. Perfect timing for that because, of course, in 2008, as I'm sure a lot of you know, if you were a realtor then, a lot of people couldn't sell their house. So they were brand new landlords and needed help. So that's where I got my start. Oh,
does the sound okay? Can you hear the speakers at all in the back?
No.
Okay,
just my voice.
Hate to do it to you.
Got to go with the ear, huh?
You gotta go with Tony Robbins.
Set up and everything.
Actually, I can just, I'll just unplug it. Sorry, it's just a lot. This is a little too personal.
Sorry.
It's a music on.
Here we go.
Just wrap that around and make sure it's in front of your mouth. And oh, I put it on my neck. So let. Give that a try.
Can you hear me now? Oh wait, I gotta turn it on. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Sorry, man, you gotta trust me. Okay.
That's gonna be annoying.
That's a
But
lot
it does
better.
work.
Well, especially for recording it, you can hear the sound.
Yeah. No, it's fine. I will just have to try to remember that you guys are up here, not down here. So anyways, I had my own management company for quite a while. But more importantly, especially with stuff like this, I'm president of the Portland Area Rental Owners Association, as well as president of the Northwest Real Estate Investor Association. And I get to be one of the co-chairs on the Rental Services Commission for the city of Portland. And so I'm one of the wonderful landlord representatives making very logical, cogent arguments that don't necessarily have a big change on bills that come through, but for what it's worth, we have successfully taken some sharp edges off of some of that stuff, just like this state bill. It starts out as a proposal that is a lot worse than it looks like today. I've been working on that, kind of not necessarily negotiating, but debating and bringing up, unintended consequences and things like that. Gosh, for at least about a year now. So it started off way worse, for whatever that's worth. Doesn't mean that you should necessarily like it. Just know that we did have some say in it. We did kind of smooth it out a little bit. So, with all that said, you notice I didn't actually say that I am an attorney, right? I am not. I do not have the patience for school to go long enough to be an attorney. So with that said, I am a landlord with a lot of experience and especially knowledge when it comes to legislative bills as they are written. With that said, I don't have official legal opinions. So if you or your client is in a situation where they think they're going to need to end up in court over anything we talk about today, highly recommend they do talk to a landlord attorney and get an official legal opinion. See, if they don't need to be scared or if they should be scared enough to start looking at writing a check, so to speak. So let's see. Also, I do understand your guys' profession, so I don't expect you to turn your phones off, but do make sure they are on silent. If you do need to, take a call or something during the class, just quietly excuse yourself. Let's see, and like I said, I covered kind of questions we're going to do before. Let's see, because I'm going in and out. All right, it's going to be right there. That's where it's going to be. Oh, no, gotta be able to breathe. Okay, so we'll jump right into it. So, Senate Bill 608 is what we're talking about today, the new wonderful state law that you and or your clients now have to deal with if you have any residential rental properties in the state of Oregon. One thing to clarify and get out of the way up front, Oregon law has completely separate sections for long-term residential rental, commercial real estate or rentals, and short-term or like vacation homes, okay? This law is written in the long-term residential section, which is ORS Chapter 90. That is the only area that it actually covers, okay? So we're not talking about anything on the commercial side or on the short-term vacation rental side today. It's simply long-term, people are renting it for, you know, at least on a month-to-month basis, as opposed to their residence, okay? This bill, unlike most bills, was given what's called a emergency classification, or passed with an emergency clause. What that is, which is not normal, but what that is that means that on February 28th, the moment that the governor put her signature on the bill, it was officially law. There was no lead time. Most bills, you know, you're not going to see them really come officially be enforceable or come into official effect until at least, you know, July, possibly even January of the next year, stuff like that. So it, you know, gives the state attorneys time to kind of digest and fine-tune the small fine print of bills, but it also gives, you know, people like landlords who it may not be your full-time job to stay educated because you have another full-time job. Give you guys time to actually know what's going on and what new laws you have to follow. Unfortunately, we did not have that luxury with this one. So the moment that bill was signed on the 28th, it was officially in effect. So there's a chance that right now you or one of your clients may have already violated it and not even known. Unfortunately, as you'll see later, it doesn't matter if you didn't know. So first thing is, this affects all, of course, leases. And that whether if it's a fixed term lease entered into after on or after February 28th, but also covers month to month. That is one thing to know about me. When I use the term lease, by definition, that is an agreement between a landlord and a tenant. Okay, a lease can be month to month. When I say lease, it doesn't mean for sure it's, you know, a 1-year lease like you may say. So there are some distinctions between month to month and year leases as far as this law is concerned. I'll make sure I point those out, of course. Let's see. So, one that someone may have already violated without knowing if they weren't up on this law and when it took effect, is if a tenant was served a no-cause notice to vacate, and that notice expired or set a move-out date that was prior to March 30th. Okay. If someone did, then I would highly recommend that if they still can, they rescind that and try to you know, make nice with the tenant. If that time is come and gone, tenant is moved, hopefully they can, you know, cross their fingers that the tenant doesn't come back to them for the penalties that could be in place or would be in place. When it comes to rent increases, so on month to month, on notices of no cause termination, which a no cause termination, if you don't know, is basically landlord is telling the tenant, it's not your fault, but I need you to move. Prior to this law, technically a no-cause termination is just that, no cause. You don't have to put a cause. If you want to, you can. You know, if it's, say I'm going to be selling the property and need it vacant, it's perfectly fine to give a cause, but there's no requirement to do so. And as long as the tenant moves out by the expiration date of that no cause, no harm, no foul. They move, you still give them, you know, a honest or good, hopefully good, recommendation to future landlords. If they don't move out by the end of that notice, then you do have a cause to actually do a forcible eviction at that point. But so a no cause notice is simply asking a tenant to move out, but it's not their fault. They didn't commit any violations or anything like that. Whether or not it's valid is based on when the actual move out date is. Different though on the rent increase side. If you or your client actually served a valid legal rent increase prior to the bill becoming law, so they would have had to serve it on February 27th or earlier, then that is still valid and you're perfectly fine. If someone served a rent increase on February 28th or later, then it does need to abide by this new law. Does it mean that they violated anything? Just they need to check what they did and they may have to adjust things based on the new law. Okay? Any questions on the dates?
I don't understand. So mean, you know, I cannot increase the rent like March or May or something?
So this is just, these dates are purely on when your notice would be valid or not, or whether or not the notice you served would be subject to this new law or not. You can still do rent increases, as you'll see later. It's just a matter of whether or not it's going to be subject to this new law or not. So if you serve that rent increase notice prior to this new law, you're perfectly fine. So, I actually had a client who was looking at buying a sixplex, and of course, in order to make it work, one, he was getting on a good deal because owner had self-managed and has had it paid off for like 15, 20 years. So rents were really low, so the total income was low, but still to finance it, still to make the numbers work for him, we needed to get those rents up to, at least 90% of current market. That would be about a 20 to, depending on which unit, 25% increase, depending on which one they are, because they were all significantly under market. He was able to negotiate into the purchase that the current owner served those rent increase notices prior to this bill going into effect, and so it was still valid. This is kind of an example. One thing I will say with this new law, as long as you have a thorough, solid lease and you're on top of managing your properties, you're doing regular adjustments to the rent each year based on the market, and you're making sure that you're taking care of, you're inspecting your property. So if you do have a tenant that is doing something you don't like, hopefully there's a violation of that lease and you're actually finding out about it and getting proof of it, you shouldn't be too negatively affected by this new law. The main area that it's going to affect, which is definitely important for everyone in this room to know as realtors, is really on the value of a rental property. For your single families, not going to be, I don't think there's going to be too much of effect because the value on that is really driven by, comparables, not necessarily the income approach. Typically, it's worth more as, for someone to live in it. With that said, when it comes to multi-units, in Oregon, since we haven't had a cap on our rent increases, you could go in, like with my client, find that property that's, for whatever reason, rents are way under market, maybe it needs to be fixed up, maybe it's just, not real thorough management on the part of the owner or something like that. It used to be that the seller would still get some, boost to the value based on potential income, because maybe it's not right, maybe it's not at market right now. As soon as you buy it, though, there's no limits on how much you raise the rents. You can bump it right up to market and get, the money you need for it. Well, now there's a limit to that, so you're not going to see as much value added for potential income, because as you'll see, every year there's going to be a cap, and I'll explain how they do that later. How they calculate that. But every year there's going to be a cap. So if you go in and buy a new property and it already has tenants in there, you have to accept those tenants and their leases. It doesn't start the occupancy timeline over, so or the rent increase cap or anything like that. Best case scenario is the previous owner didn't do a rent increase, even though I'm sure their realtor advised them to do a rent increase before they listed it, so they could list it for a little more, right? But best case scenario would be they didn't do a rent increase, and that new buyer can assume that they're going to be able to raise the rents by whatever that maximum cap is that year, not necessarily all the way to market if they're low enough. So, did I touch on your question back there?
I'll just verify. So if they're buying a property that's vacant, they can go to market.
Yes, for the most part. You'll see there's some exceptions though. Okay. So first thing we're going to go through is the no-cause termination portion of this law. So there's two sections. One deals with no-cause terminations. The other one deals with rent increases. Okay, we'll hit the rent increases last. So
Now to clarify, you're talking
Yeah.
about state law, not city.
state law.
Right.
That is other thing I should clarify. For the sanity and clarity of everyone in the room, please do not try to ask questions about the City of Portland ordinances. It regulates the same stuff, but it's different in enough of a minute amount that it just gets confusing. I'll happily answer questions on that after if you want, but try not to have any City of Portland questions during the class, because I promise I will just confuse everybody. Welcome to being a landlord in Oregon and the City of Portland. Let's see. Okay, so with no cause terminations, this wasn't a change. It was like this before. You're allowed to do a no cause termination of a lease in the first year with a 30-day notice. Okay. Another thing to keep in mind, all notices, if you end up mailing those notices, then you do have to add the 3 days for mailing, and the day you put in the mail doesn't count, so it's really 4 days at that point. So you've always been able to do that, you can still do that. You still do a 30-day notice, no cause termination the first year. One thing that this has done, if you do month-to-month agreements, then you don't really have to worry about this next part, because obviously just sometime prior to, at least 30 days prior to them living their year, you can give them a no-cause termination if things just aren't working out, or for whatever reason. You don't have to have a reason. What we do within my company, we do 1-year leases that we always try to renew every year for another year, okay? The way that we used to calculate the lease expiration date was if, say they moved in on, in the middle of the month, say they moved in April 15th this year, we would run that lease until the end of April the following year. So technically it would be a year plus a couple weeks. Keeps my bookkeeper happy, because things, she likes things to all happen on the same dates every month. But also, it ends up increasing our average, lease term or occupancy term by at least a couple weeks. Thousands of units, those dollars add up. Now though, we have to do our policy separately, because in order to maintain your right to do a 30-day no-cause notice, you have to be able to serve it so that their move-out date or the expiration date is after their lease term, but prior to them living there a full year, okay? So our lease is going a year plus a couple weeks, makes it so that we don't have that option. So now we have to back it up. So now all of our leases are actually gonna be probably a week or two short of a full year. So if your clients did things that way, make sure you do make a note of that when calculating your lease expiration. It needs to be less than, or at the very least exactly 1 year later, okay? Otherwise, if you go any longer than a year, you won't have the ability to do a no-cause notice. Okay? And there are some situations where landlord and tenant just don't get along, and so it's very convenient to be able to use that no cause, and tenant avoids an eviction, landlord gets to move on to hopefully a better tenant or a better relationship.
Is this for multifamily and single family?
Yes, this is for all residential rentals in the state of Oregon.
So are you saying that you sign a 1-year lease, say 1 week less than a year, and then you renew for the next term, you still have that no cost termination?
No, so his question was, if you do a 1-year lease, it's a little bit less than a year, and then you renew for another year, does that mean you would still have the no cost termination? No, you just have it in the first year. And after the first year, you're not allowed to do a no cause termination at all. With that said, as we're going to go over here in a second, there are some new causes that are not the tenant's fault that you'll be able to use. But I think there was another question over here. No? Okay. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so if the first year you are actually going 51 weeks rather
Sure.
than the full year, then from the second year on, could you go back to the way that you were doing it before?
Absolutely. So our question was, if the first year you go a week or two short, if you renew for another year, would you then, would it hurt anything to go for that full year back to how we did it, where it's a year plus maybe a week or two or something? Absolutely fine. No problem there, because you don't have the ability to do a no cause notice in the second year, so you're not giving anything up. So absolutely perfectly fine. Let's see. So one area that one thing that this does kind of hurt when it comes to the fact that you can't do a no cause notice in the second year is that you really can only have the ability to force a tenant to sign a new 1-year lease or choose to move out in this first renewal, okay? Because the kind of teeth, so to speak, or what you would be able to do is you can send your tenant, hey, here's what the lease terms are going to be for your next, for your second year there. We need you to go ahead and sign those, but at the same time, which, if you're worried they're not going to, or, you want to make sure that's the only, they understand that's the only option you're willing to take, you can also at the same time serve a no cause notice. And it says basically pick one. Either, sign the new lease term for your second year to commit to that, or you'll have to move out. Now, it's very rare that we ever are that strong about it. Normally we give them different options and stuff like that, but I'm just kind of using the extreme as an example, okay? In the second renewal, so say they renew after a year, that comes and goes, so now they've been there 2 years, and you're looking at renewing for a third year, 1 year lease. You can't actually force them to sign it because you're not able to do the no cause, right? Also, if they are paying their rent on time and not committing any violations or anything like that, then as you're gonna see here in a second, you're not gonna be able to force them to move out. So they would be able to say, I have no interest in signing anything, but I'm still gonna pay my rent on time, and I'm just gonna go month to month, whether you like it or not. So what you need to do, which is also what I've advised landlords in the past to do, is kind of a best practice anyway, is if your goal is you want them to renew for another full year, and just to use round numbers, let's say this unit's been renting out for $1,000 a month, and market rent on it right now, if it was vacant, would be $1,100, okay? You can then go to them and say, hey, sign this 1 year renewal, and your rent will only go up by $50, even though market says I would be able to get 100, but I would love to be able to have you committed for another full year. I save some money if you don't move out, since I don't have turnover expenses or vacancies, anything like that. But then you also give them the option of, hey, if you want, you can go month to month, but that rent is going to be the full $1,100 for the full market, okay? Or, you know, whatever amount, if you really don't want them to do it, doesn't really matter what market is. Maybe market rent only went up by $75, but as you'll see later, you could raise your rent, maybe say on month to month, you're gonna pay whatever the maximum is after I do the maximum rent increase that year, or something to that effect. But basically, you give them the options, but make the cheap, easy one for them be the one that you want them to choose, okay? Let's see. Okay, so I told you, so after that first year, you can't do any no-cause notices, but you can use some of these new reasons to ask a tenant to move out through no fault of their own after they've lived there a year, okay? So the first one is if the rental unit is purchased separately from the other rental units on that property, okay, or tax lot. Main thing that you'll probably see this come into play, if it does, is going to be like your condo conversion project, okay? You know, investor buys or builds even, you know, this, you know, 6 unit or 10 unit or whatever, sometimes much larger, complex that's like, you know, side-by-side condos or townhome style, something like that. When they go to sell, instead of, you know, selling it all as just one big rental property, they go through the extra effort and cost to separate them as individual condos and sell them individually. That would qualify as one of the reasons after the first year to ask that tenant to move out of the one unit that's being sold, okay? Pretty straightforward. The other one that qualifies when it's a purchase is if the buyer intends to use the property as their primary residence. So this would definitely come up quite a bit for the people in this room, I would imagine. You know, you have the person that's selling that single family home rental. It's, you know, your single family home rental typically is going to end up selling to someone that wants to live in it, right? If that is the case, then once you and your client, your seller, have an accepted offer, you can issue the tenant a notice to move out at no fault of their own through this. You do have to be able to provide evidence if you're able to get it. As you'll notice, not all of these reasons are you able to get it, but this is one where it would kind of be like if, you know, you're buying a property through an FHA loan that requires you to live in. You know, typically there's, you know, an additional, just, you know, notarized document or something that you sign, just simply stating, I so-and-so on or after this date intend to occupy the property at such and such location as my primary residence. So if you are selling a property that is going to be subject to this, the buyer is going to move into it, there's currently a tenant in it, make sure you add to the purchase agreement in the negotiation process that the buyer needs to provide you or your client a notarized document, just a separate, you know, one-page sheet, doesn't need anything super complicated, just attesting that they do fully intend to move into the property. That'll make sure your client is protected. If for some reason they're using this as a loophole, or they're completely lying through their teeth, whatever it may be, your client, the one who's going to have to serve the notice to the tenant, will have, you know, solid proof that, to the best of their knowledge, they did qualify and that buyer is intending to move in. Okay. In the fine print, you'll see that you need to give that notice within 120 days of accepting that offer from someone that's going to live in it. It doesn't need to expire within the 120 days, you just have to serve it. So the reason for that is because also the tenant side knows, just as well as we do, the day you have an accepted offer, you're still a long ways away from actually closing that transaction, right? You know, you've got the appraisal, the inspection, and of course, buyer actually being fully financed before you get there. So you're not gonna wanna tell your client who's selling the property, hey, serve this notice right away, because if this falls through, but that tenant already started looking and found a place and is planning on moving, all of a sudden your client now no longer has a tenant in there, you know, paying that rent every month. But you can't wait more than 120 days. Typically, that's never gonna be an issue. But if say you had a buyer that was like, I'm gonna buy it, I'm gonna move into it, but I don't need to move it, I don't wanna move into it for, you know, 6 months from now or something like that, then that might come in handy. You can delay, you know, giving that notice as much as possible. But, you know, it's still, you just can't go more than the 120 days after the offer's actually been accepted.
So you're not allowed to ask the tenant to leave before you put the house on the market?
Correct. Yeah, you have to. He asked if you're allowed to ask the tenant to leave before you put it on the market. The answer is no. You would be required to wait until you actually have an offer from someone that intends to live in it. At that point, you'd be able to ask the tenant to move out.
How many days?
An accepted offer, not just received one, just clarify that. Yeah.
How many days does the tenant receive to move?
The notice is 90 days after that first year. Yep. Okay. So next one, in the back, yeah.
So when a buyer, the lender requires that they occupy within 60 days, how is, let's say.
Well,
we
it's
give
typically
90
they have to
days
occupy
notice.
within 60 days of closing, correct?
Yes.
So this is, you give them 90-day notice. Typically, you're not gonna see more than a 30-day closing, I would assume. I mean, it's possible, but you know, anyone that's can close faster than 30 days is typically willing to wait 30 days if they had to for something like this. So you would, at that, but let's say it was just a 30-day close, then the day, and they need to move in within 60, then it's gonna be tight. But you would basically need to serve that 90-day notice, asking the tenant to move out the day you have an accepted offer. And then that should expire, you know, roughly about 60 days after closing. It's a tight kind of juggling match there, of course, with schedules, and who knows, maybe the tenant will happily move sooner because they found a place that they love. But it is definitely something you're gonna have to do, make sure your client's doing the math. Oh yeah.
So if they don't wanna do that, and
Mhm.
say you do the 90 days notice, the buyer's willing to pay a lot of money for an extended rate lock and
Sure.
close 90 days later. If it falls through an appraisal or something
Mhm.
30 days into it, do you get your money back that you gave them with the notice? Like, how does that work?
So what she asked is basically, say you go down this road, you serve that notice to the tenant, deal falls through, and tenant hasn't moved yet. Are you able to get what you'll see here later on, the relocation fee that you paid back from that tenant, kind of rescind that move out notice? You could ask for it. If the tenant's already put wheels in motion and, you know, I've already said, oh, we're on our way, I wouldn't force the issue either. Now, with that said, I don't know if that's necessarily the worst scenario either, because now maybe it's back on the market and you have a tenant with a move-out date that'll then be, you know, a vacant unit. So typically, you're going to be dealing with as a single family, and you know, single family is typically a little bit easier to sell when it doesn't have a tenant in it. Doesn't necessarily mean your client's going to be happy about that, because they don't know, you know, when it's officially going to sell, you know, where their finances are. But I wouldn't force the issue, because you've already served the notice, you've already put the wheels in motion. And even if the tenant came back to me and said, well, we're going to keep looking, but you know, we've only spent, you know, $100 so far on application fees, blah blah. How about if they offered you basically, we'll give it back to you, but we've already spent this money? I would happily accept. But as far as I know, you wouldn't necessarily have a way to force them to stay and pay the money back. Now, if a sale fell through and they weren't moving, they didn't find a place, and it ended up not selling, or for whatever reason, then you would definitely, I think, have right to ask for that money back from the tenant, because they're not moving, they're not gonna be using it, they're not out anything, and you're no longer selling it, so that reason is no longer valid. With that said, like a lot of stuff in landlord-tenant law, everything I just said is not actually written in the law. And it's brand new, so of course this has not been the court and tested. So it's one of many areas where if I was in that specific situation, I would tread lightly, but I think if tenant stayed and I was no longer selling it and everything just went back to normal, I feel like you would have solid grounds to force the issue that they owe you the money back. I think I saw over here first. Yep.
Doesn't FHA require you to move in within 30 days of closing?
I am not 100% sure. I'm a landlord expert, not an FHA lender expert. So I'm not 100% sure. As it stands right now though, whether you like it or not, I mean, basically if you were in that situation where it was 30 days after closing, you would just have to time it to where, all right, well, we need to be shooting for, you know, a 70-day close then. So that way we can issue that 90-day notice now type of thing. Probably longer, because I'm guessing if you're representing the seller, you're gonna wanna at least have a little bit of time to wait and make sure that, you know, they're not gonna have egregious inspection, you know, conditions and stuff like that. But it's definitely, you'll have to juggle those dates, you know. I don't have a good answer for you.
So if you're a realtor and your seller is a landlord for years, you know, maybe the tenant is multiple tenants, whatever, but the property's run down. And the best scenario for the seller would be to make improvements before they sell the property.
Sure.
To get the value. What options do they have to get the tenant out and start with repairs?
Perfect segue to the next one, but let me answer the next question first, because it's on topic. I think I saw.
Yes, just to clarify, the new termination process is 120 days, and then the notice to vacate the property is in 90 days. And those are different timelines, and you cannot notify them until the house is on the market.
Right, so the 120 days and the 90 days, they are two different timelines. So if you use any of these reasons we're talking about to serve, ask the tenant to move out, it's the 90-day notice. That's what that one is. The 120 days is the amount of time you have to ask a tenant to move out, to serve that notice after an offer is actually accepted. So it has nothing to do with when it's listed, but once you have an accepted offer, you have to give them the 90-day notice. You just have to serve it within 120 days. It doesn't have to expire within 120 days. Technically, it just has to be a minimum of 90. You could make it longer if you had to, but it just has to be served within 120.
Okay, so the
Real quick.
Sorry, really quick. 90-day notice to vacate the property. You can present it to the tenant even before you list the property.
No.
Okay.
Anytime between an accepted offer and 120 days after an accepted offer. Yep.
So if the offer falls through, there's no obligation to extend the client to stay if you don't want them to.
I don't know.
Come back and get them as a buyer.
I mean, I feel like no, because you've already served the notice and done that. But if the tenant said, well, here's your money back, I don't really want to go anywhere.
What money are you talking about?
The relocation fee, we're going to talk about it in a second. Someone brought it up, but anyways, if they said, I don't want to move, I want to stick around, I wouldn't try to evict them for it because I wouldn't be able to necessarily prove it anymore. So technically there's no answer to your question of whether or not you can actually force them to keep going if your sale falls through. If it were me, I would allow them to keep doing whatever they're planning on doing. If it ends up being that they come back to me and say, I don't want to stick around, I wouldn't do any, I would say, okay. And I wouldn't feel confident trying to force the issue if my sale fell through. With that said, hopefully by then you have another accepted offer and they want to move into. And then, you know, you should still be fine. You might, well, just to cover your bases, you might want to go ahead and reissue that notice with the new offer being accepted. But yeah, you wouldn't be able to really, I don't know that you'd be able to force the issue if your sale fell through and the tenant didn't want to move.
We don't have to tell them it fell through though, right?
There's nothing that, I mean, I can't stand up here and advise that you handle it that way. With that said, there is nothing in the law that specifically states that. So that's kind of what I meant by Maybe you just let them do whatever they're planning on doing anyway, and you just kind of stay out of the way. Yeah. Okay, so back there.
So if somebody has a friend, brother, whatever, somebody in their.
Sounds like a very specific
property that
scenario.
says, I don't care about the law, I'll leave when you want me to. Is there
Sounds nice.
any, addendum, like how
No.
do we as
No.
agents protect
If you
our-
have someone in there that's your friend or family and they say, I don't care what the law is, we'll just handle it this way. Great, sounds fine. There's nothing you can sign though that takes away their right to change their mind. So, if it was my client, I would advise them to still handle it how they're supposed to. Obviously, if my client wants to ignore me and roll the dice, they can. You know, maybe if they do completely trust them, then great. All right, so try to stay away from very specific scenarios. Just stick to the content. I'll answer specific scenarios after we're done, because I got a lot to cram in here. Yep.
So if, you wanna sell a house and investors wanna buy it to flip it,
Mm-hmm.
you can't do that?
You can. It's just that if investors want to buy it to flip it, you can. But that's talking about the renovations. I haven't even gotten there yet.
Oh, okay.
So, next. All right, perfect. Okay, so landlord intends to demolish or convert to a non-residential use. Demolish is pretty straightforward, but just to be clear, it does not mean doing a 80 or 90% studs up remodel. It means wiping the structure off of the earth. Okay, you don't have to be building anything else. Doesn't matter what your plans are after that. But if your plan or your client's plan is to demolish the structure that is a rental, that qualifies as a reason to ask the tenant to move out after they've been there a year. This one I think is pretty straightforward. As far as proof or evidence, it doesn't say this specifically in the law, of course. I would recommend wait to ask the tenant to move out until you've actually filed for or applied for the demolition permit. I'm sure anyone that's been involved or within arm's reach of someone that has been involved in demolishing something, you're not getting approval and you're not gonna have a bulldozer on the property anytime in the next 3 to 6 months most likely. It takes a while, okay? So don't worry, you can wait until you file that application and then serve the 90-day notice, and you're still fine and you have a copy of something other than just your word that you do have a qualified reason, okay? Next one is converting a non-residential use. So, there's one part of this that's very clear, and there's another part that I've had questions on that honestly I'm not sure how it's going to be handled. So on the side of converting to commercial office space use, something like that, it's a house that's sitting on one of those streets that's now, super busy, and someone wants to use it as a coffee shop or, a law office or whatever it may be. That's pretty straightforward. It's literally you're converting it from someone who's actually living there to no one's living there, it's a business of some kind, okay? The side that's not as clear is, say you're gonna change your property from a long-term rental to a short-term vacation rental. Well, technically, as far as I understand the letter of this law and the intent, that should qualify, because it's technically no longer part of residential long-term rental law. That's not even governed by this, and it is technically a non-residential use, kind of. If I had a client that had me serve that notice to one of their tenants, and that tenant was pissed off about it and was not going anywhere, and I knew that they were planning on they would be talking to a lawyer about it or something, I probably wouldn't push the issue. If I felt like tenant will probably move and everything will go pretty smoothly, I'd probably roll the dice on it. So take that for what it is. I can't unfortunately be any clearer than that, even though I know that's not clear at all. I don't get to choose what I tell you. I just tell you the facts, unfortunately. So converting non-residential use. Next one, which a couple of you hit on, is if the landlord intends to repair or renovate. So on the surface, it sounds like this is a very nice loophole, right? Hey, I gotta repaint the place, that's a repair, right? It has to be something where, and I'll go into a little more detail on this here in a second, so bear with me. It has to be something where what is being repaired is something that is causing a habitability violation, which I'm going to do a quick review of the habitability requirements here in a second. But Basically, there's a set of requirements as far as rentals are concerned in Oregon. You have to meet all those minimum standards to officially say it's habitable, someone can live in it, okay? So if you're repairing something that violates one of those, or, and this is where, if you're buying it to do a full renovation of all the properties and stuff, this is where you'd still be able to do that. If the repair or renovation you're doing would cause a habitability violation or issue, okay? So habitability issues, okay, of course there's, just general health and safety, right? So if it's a unit that has a attic that is completely filled with mold and it's gonna be basically impossible to eradicate everything and actually have the living quarters sealed off, that causes a health issue, that's a habitability problem, okay? But then there's also the, if it's, no matter what, they always have to have at least one working bathroom to get rid of their waste properly, as well as fresh water to bathe in. Obviously, they have to have access to fresh water to drink as well. They need to be able to cool or store their food for, you say long term, but you get what I'm saying. In the fridge, not everything lasts for a long time, but they need to have some way to cool their food. They need to have a way to cook their food. Okay, all the windows and doors have to be able to be securely locked and latched. And door latch. And the unit, inside of the unit always has to be protected from the elements outside, all right? In the winter months, there has to be at least one heat source in the unit. So there are, this list of habitability issues. So for the most part, yeah, if you're gonna be doing a full remodel, obviously, there's not gonna be working plumbing and, who knows how secure the place is going to be if they're, replacing doors or whatever. There's multiple habitability issues that'll pop up in that, and so you're going to be okay. So there's a couple areas though where it might be a little bit more gray, or well, just not really habitability issues. Say you've got a 2-bathroom unit that two full bathroom unit that one of the bathrooms, the entire floor is dry rot. And you didn't know it, and the landlord didn't know it until they did their inspection and almost fell through the floor. You're gonna have to tear out everything in that bathroom. Odds are they're not gonna have that bathroom or be able to use it for at least a couple of weeks, and that's if you have a contractor that's just really on top of their schedule, so, that's not exactly always something you can expect. So probably take at least a few weeks, maybe even a month or something like that, depending on what all you're doing. If they have another fully operational bathroom, technically it's not a habitability issue, okay? I mean, for that month, they might be renting a place now with 1 bathroom, so you might need to work out a fair, reasonable rent credit or something that month, but they have perfectly working facilities, they have access to fresh water. It's not a habitability issue, you're just doing that one, okay? One of the areas where it gets kind of gray is how long, because not all, there might be a habitability issue, but it's something where, honestly, you're gonna be able to have it fixed in under a week, or a couple days or something. There is nothing in the law that specifically says, if it's gonna be uninhabitable for less than this amount of time, then you're required to get them a hotel room and let them move back in, or if it's uninhabitable for more than this amount of time, you're able to go ahead and ask them to move out. Nothing in the law decides where that cutoff is, okay? So, best practice, I would say, for us, we're probably gonna draw that line right about a week. But it also might be situational. If we have a tenant that's like, I don't care, it's gonna take 2 weeks, I wanna move back in. We'd probably work with them in one way or another, okay? But if it is something where it's gonna be like a week or less, the tenant doesn't want to go anywhere, then I would argue you probably should at least offer to let them stay in a hotel room that you pay for them, okay, for that short amount of time. If you really want them to move out, maybe in that time you say, if you want, I can get you a hotel room, or if you want, just qualify for a reason and for me to ask you to move out as well, so I can go ahead and give you that notice, and as you'll see here in a second, the relocation fee, and you can go ahead and go along your merry way and let them kind of decide at that point. But if it is shorter term, if you have any question at all on whether it's too short of a time, then I would err on the side of at least giving them the option, okay? If you're doing a major renovation to fix it up so the rents are gonna be higher and they wanna move back in, that's a little bit tougher situation, as you'll see, because you can only increase the rent by so much. So you might wanna, use one of these reasons to ask them to move out and then just encourage them to reapply as a brand new tenant after you're finally done. But yeah, it won't be super clear and cut all the time. But yeah, so as far as renovations go, if you are repairing a habitability issue or it'll cause a habitability issue, you can use that as a reason to ask them to move out. In the back?
You put them in a hotel, what do you have to pay for the breakfast, lunch, dinner?
So he asked if you put them in a hotel where you have to pay basically other expenses. As far as Oregon landlord tenant law is concerned, doesn't address it. What I always do, and what is typically recommended by any lawyer, is if you want to if you want to dig your heels in the sand and make a legal argument that, hey, it doesn't say it in the part of the law that governs me, so I'm not doing it, more power to you. Always remember, even if you're right, normally it costs a lot of money to win a lawsuit. With what I would say is that if you look at other sections of law, sometimes you can kind of cite, or at least just follow, so if you ever end up in front of a judge, you have a logical argument of this is why I made the decision I did, and it has nothing to do with just me and my opinions, right? So what I typically look at in that situation, is I get that question all the time, especially in this class, is the insurance industry, okay? If you are a homeowner and you go on vacation for a couple weeks and your third floor toilet decided to overflow and continue running, you've got an entirely flooded out house, hopefully you've got flood insurance as well, you're able to get that repaired. Insurance company will rent you a place. They will give you an additional per diem because they make the assumption that if renting you a hotel, you're not going to be able to save money by cooking food at home. They'll also give you a per diem if the place that they're renting you is, say it's 3 miles farther away from their work and or school commutes. They will compensate them for those miles every day there and back. So my recommendation would be, yes, if you have to put them up in the hotel room, if they do have other extra expenses, offer to cover those. With that said, Oregon law in the landlord tenant section does not specifically state that a landlord has to do that. But I would definitely argue it's a good best practice. So,
If you wanted to remodel the bathrooms and kitchens before you put it on, rental house on the market, is that a good enough excuse?
he asked if you wanted to remodel the kitchens and bathrooms before you put a house on the market. Is that a good enough excuse? Well, technically, I think so. I mean, based on the way the law is written, I mean, as long as you're actually doing that, and you're going to be, because if you're there without a bathroom, if they don't have bathroom facilities, and they don't have, I mean, either one of those technically causes a habitability issue. If they don't have both, it definitely does. Based on the way it's written, I would say, yes, it probably does qualify. But make sure you have that serious talk with your client of, you're actually tearing this stuff up, right? Like, I don't want to find out that we get them moved out, and then within a week you're saying, oh yeah, go ahead and start showing it now, nothing's changing. Like, make sure that they are actually going to be doing a full remodel of those, and make sure that it's a big enough remodel that's not just going to be, you know, a week or less project too. So obviously, you know, I'm remodeling my kitchen and bathrooms. That can have a different definition on how big of a remodel that is. If it's, you know, paint and flooring, probably doesn't qualify. Technically, even though it'll be a hassle, and the tenant won't be happy about it, technically they can still use those facilities, even if you're just doing paint and flooring, right? So, kind of depends specifically, but most likely, yes.
A question: if the owner has new buyer buys the house with an ADU, puts a tenant in ADU, year and a half later, city comes back to him and says, hey, this ADU is illegal, you're not supposed to have tenant in it.
Okay.
Now, and they telling you have to evict the tenant to the illegal too. Are you legally to remove the tenant without?
Yeah, so what you're talking about, I asked if, say you had a tenant, it doesn't really matter about purchasing or not, it's still the same scenario. Say you had a tenant in an ADU, and it was later found out that the city considered that ADU not legitimate, and for whatever reason you decided you didn't want to go through the permitting process to make it legitimate. And they're requiring that, hey, this tenant has to move out because it's not a livable unit. Should qualify, should be fine for you to give the 90-day notice. It's fine if they want to have a couple-week requirement on it. In my experience, and again, I definitely cannot speak for all cities, and that'll always happen this way, so don't necessarily quote me on to take this one to the bank, but in my experience in those situations, because I have had it, not necessarily it's an unlivable unit, but I've had it where, you know, I've had hoarders in units that made them violate fire safety code and things like that. Typically, if I can show them, hey, here's a copy of the notice that I served, you know, right away after I got your information and your notice, by Oregon law, I have to give them this amount of time. Typically, they will work with you because most of those city departments, they're never happy, but they're at least pacified if you can prove that, yes, I'm an owner that's actually doing stuff. I did take some action and I'm moving forward. That's not gonna buy you an infinite amount of time, but I have definitely gotten multiple extensions on my warning expirations and avoided fees and stuff like that. I'm sure this is not the most common scenario, but I've even had one where it took so long because the tenant was refusing to go places and whatnot, just a whole bunch of different scenarios, there were different things that they ended up issuing fines. But then once we did officially have the issue fixed and taken care of and verified that, they took, I think, like 75% of the fines off or something to that effect. So there's nothing clear in the law that says, hey, if you've got this agency telling you 2 weeks, but the law says 90 days, defer to the landlord-tenant law. Make sure you're not violating those tenant rights, because you'll see it and cost you a significant amount of money, but also make sure you are communicating with whatever government agency is giving you that notice to show that I'm doing stuff. And that'll give you your best chances. It's not a guarantee though. And I will say, if it's an ADU and the main unit is your primary residence, you'll see later you do have a lot of exceptions too, but we'll go over that here in a second. Did I see another one? Oh, I need to get moving. Okay. I'm running out of time. I keep telling you I'm going to go over stuff, and you're looking at our clocks like, wait a minute, we're supposed to be moving on. Okay, and repair, renovate. What we got next? This one's pretty straightforward. The landlord or their immediate family member. So the one and only time I will bring up Portland. The Portland ordinance exemption does not include the owner of the property, just family. Statewide though, if it is the owner of the property is going to move into the unit, or an immediate family member. You have the definition there, as well as of what an immediate family member is, as well as in the copy of the law that you guys got handed out. If you or a client thinks that they have an immediate family member that's going to qualify for this in the future at some point, do a quick check to look up the law at that point, because it is kind of in the fine print in the definition section. Technically, they could, via committee, stuff like that, actually change that a little bit. So it is good to just double check that, hey, yes, your adopted brother-in-law or something, it does still qualify or not. But as of right now, it's a pretty big definition in that typically if it's not too far removed, but typically it's, by blood or marriage or adoption, odds are it will qualify. But it also qualifies them moving into it. So say you've got a client who's buying that single family home rental and they want to continue renting it out for a year or something like that. So they're not going to move into it right away. So it wouldn't really be able to give them that notice for the reason of the buyer intending to occupy the unit. But you can still reassure your client that, hey, when it does come time, if you've got a tenant in there, as long as they're not in the middle of a fixed term lease, they're month to month or at the end of one, you will be able to ask them to move out. Okay? Any questions on that one? Pretty straightforward, yeah.
The landlord can't own a comparable.
Also goes for them intending to live in one of the units, okay? So I'll use that scenario of someone buying it, but understand it's still the same if it's, down the road, you've already bought it and want to move into one. Say it's a fourplex, okay? If all of the units are 2-bedroom, 1-bath units, okay, then they are, a reasonable person would consider them comparable, okay? There's not a definition of meets these points and it is or is not comparable, but I would argue, even if the square footage fluctuates a bit, bed bath count being the same, you could probably say they're comparable. If in that fourplex there is a middle unit vacant, but the owner wants to, or the new buyer wants to move into one of the end units because they want those extra 1 or 2 windows, they don't get to do that. They have to take the one that is currently vacant because it is comparably the same. Now, if those two middle units, or that one that was vacant was a 2-bedroom, 1 bath, and the end units are 3-bedroom, 2 bath units, I would argue those are not comparable units. Those aren't the same, they're not gonna have the same rent amount, different square footage, different bed bath count. You would be fine to ask the end unit to move out in that case, because there is no vacant unit that's comparable.
What if the landlord has a vacant unit in another school district, but they want their kids to stay?
Sounds like a specific scenario that I do not have an answer to.
Okay.
I feel like, probably just like you're thinking, I can make a pretty strong argument that if the school districts aren't anywhere close to the same, that they aren't comparable. Plain devil's advocate, if I'm a tenant attorney, I can make a very strong argument that irregardless of school district, same bed bath count, close to similar rents and stuff, they are comparable. So it'll definitely be more of a case by case, I would say. Quick.
Does the law apply to, homes that you rent rooms?
Yep.
Is there any provision like cash for keys?
No. So her question was, does the law apply to homes where you rent the rooms individually? Yes, absolutely, if you have them all on individual leases. If you rent to five roommates, you put them all in one lease, then it does apply, but it applies as though no different than a family renting that as one full unit. And as you'll see later, the fact that you have different leases and it counted as 5 units versus just 1 unit, if you rent it to roommates on one lease or a whole family, will make a big difference here in a second. And yours, is there a provision for like cash for keys, essentially a way for maybe you pay the tenant a little more and they move out a little faster or something like that? No. You can reach any agreement with anyone you want at any time, but also keep in mind, basic contract law, nobody can be required to sign away their rights. So, absolutely you can do that. There is no 100% guarantee though, that the tenant wouldn't be able to come back on that landlord later if they decided to. So, odds are it would be fine, because they're getting a little more money, and if they're willing to do it, they're probably fine with it. Most likely you're gonna be fine. I wouldn't necessarily bank my money on it. If it was my client, I would tell them just that. You are gambling a little bit. They could come back and it could bite you, but if you 100% believe them, then that's, you know, it's your money to risk. So, okay, let's get moving. I've covered a couple of these already. The notices are 90 days if you use any of these reasons. If there is any evidence to be had, you need to provide that. And you do have to pay a relocation fee equal to 1 full month's rent. Before you ask the question, if the tenant owes you money, no, you cannot deduct it from this fee. You owe them this fee, period. Whether the tenant owes you money or not, it is a separate transaction from their move out. And you also pay it at the time you're giving the notice. So not after they move out or anything like that, okay? There's no legal way to deduct anything from it. It is just owed. One quick caveat, if your tenant owes you money and you're considering that, using one of these reasons to ask them to move out, stop it. You can legally force a tenant to pay you money they owe you. I mean, obviously non-payment of rent is pretty straightforward. You evict them for non-payment of rent. But if they owe you, say, $200 or $250 for, you know, miscellaneous late fees over the years that you've cited them for, you've billed them for, but you've never forced the issue, you can give them 30 days to pay it, and then if they don't, you can force them by giving them, okay, now here's your for-cause termination for not paying your debts to me as your landlord. You now have 14 additional days to come up with the money, or in 30 days, your lease terminates. All of that, even if they didn't pay you, they didn't go anywhere, and you had to go through an official eviction process, all of that will happen in less than 90 days, and depending on the scenario, if you don't have to hire a lawyer because you have solid grounds and you know you've got your stuff in place, it's going to be less than 90 days and definitely cost you significantly less than 1 full month's rent to go through that route if you have to. So, number one, it shouldn't even be a question, because if they do owe you money, force them to pay it. You might get rid of them faster and you don't have to pay the relocation fee. Yes?
When you have paid moving money to tenant, when? 30 days before?
At the time you serve the notice.
Oh. So
the day you give them a 90-day notice to move out, you have to pay that fee. You do not have to pay it if you give them the no-cause notice in the first year. This all applies if you use one of these reasons we just talked about to ask them to move out through no fault of their own in the second year. Okay?
But if they don't move out, they have to get money. What do you do?
If you have to give them the 90-day notice to move, pay them the relocation fee. If they don't go anywhere, then you'll have grounds to do a for-cause eviction. Whether or not you get your money back, I do not know. The law doesn't apply and it hasn't gone to court yet. All right.
So, and this is per household, the notice of one?
Per lease. So if you had that 5-unit or that 5-bedroom place, you decided to rent out individual leases to each unit, effectively causing it 5 separate units. That is 5 separate ones you're paying. With that said, this is 1 month's rent in a fee. It's probably not costing you that much more. You know, I mean, odds are you did it that way because you make an extra, you know, $200 to $500 a month instead of renting it out as a whole thing. Some places maybe even $1,000 if it's a great location. So it's going to cost you more, but not terribly much. Where it really comes into play, though, I'm going to keep moving on because I know we're running out of time, but I will stick around to answer specific questions. Just make a note of it, okay? If you have 1, 2, 3, or 4 total units, so this is where that whole renting out room by room may hurt you. If you have 1, 2, 3, or 4 total units, rental units, in the state of Oregon, then you are exempt from the relocation fee. Okay? You still have to abide by this law. You could still only use these reasons to ask them to move out after they live there 1 full year. But if you have 4 or less units, you don't have to pay the actual relocation fee. Okay? One quick clarification before I move on from here. It doesn't matter how much of a unit you own. If you have any ownership in it, it counts as 1 unit on your portfolio. Okay? So also, owning them in individual LLCs is not a loophole. Even owning them through your IRA, which as far as the IRS is concerned, and pretty much every other area of government, it's a totally separate person and entity. Not the case with this. If you have any ownership connection in any way to 5 or more units, you have to pay the relocation fees. But if it's 4 or less, you're fine. You still have to abide by the law as far as the new reasons go, but you don't have to pay the fee. Really quick, I might skip it.
I heard from somebody else that there was not case law on that if it's managed by a property manager, that property manager has more than 4 units.
No, it is by owner, not by property manager. So if you as an individual own 2 units, but you hire my company as a management company that obviously manages a lot more than just 4 units, you're still exempt from paying that fee. It's based off of ownership, not off of management. Okay. Let's see here. So 3 strikes. So after that first year, as we talked about before, you can't give the no cause notice. So say the tenant's not doing anything wrong, you don't have you don't qualify for any of those reasons to ask them to move out. Or no, sorry, let me rephrase that. The tenant's doing some things wrong, but they fixed them all, so you couldn't evict them on it. If they've committed 3 violations of any kind, doesn't matter, big or small, doesn't matter if they fixed them after the fact or anything like that. They commit 3 violations of any kind, including paying rent late, FYI, that is a violation of your lease. If they commit any 3 violations in the last 12 months of their fixed lease term, you can have that lease actually expire. Okay? You have to give them a 90-day notice prior to, and let them know, obviously this is the reason why, and here's all the violations you had. Here's a copy of the violation warning notices that I gave you. But you can't, that's the only way you can actually have a lease terminate or expire at the end of its lease term after they've lived there for 1 full year. In the first year, obviously, you still have your no cause notice you can use. But after that, you're stuck with them if they aren't committing violations. But if they do 3, you can ask them to move out.
Okay, you have to give them written notice.
Yep. You have to give them written notice. This goes aside from this. So any violation at all, give your tenant written notice. The reason is if you do not, if you know about a violation, you do not give them any official notice. Even if it's, I don't want to kick you out, I just want to say, you violated my lease. Here's your warning, okay? Even as simple as that. If you don't give them that, and 3 rent payment cycles pass, so 3 months pass since you've known about it, you have legally effected what's called a waiver, which is you have changed your lease. It now officially allows for whatever that violation is, and you no longer have the right to do anything about it. Okay, so yes, this law aside, if your tenant commits any violation, at least give them a warning. You have to document it. Otherwise, you may have, without knowing it, legally given them permission to continue doing it.
What if those violations occur in month 11 or 10?
You can still, if a 3rd violation occurs in the last month, you can still give them the 90-day notice. It's just they're not required to move out at the end of your lease. It'll be when that 90-day notice expires. Oh, I think I skipped one. Yes, okay. So this is that one. So if you live on a property that only has one other rental unit, okay, so typically duplex, but maybe it's the ADU, maybe it's, you've got, daylight basement that has full living quarters, but it's, there's stairs that are connecting, so it's not officially duplex, but it is one rental unit. If you live have a primary residence on that same property as one rental unit, then you are exempt from all of the stuff I just talked about for that one unit, okay? So you can still do, in the second year, instead of having to have one of those reasons and paying a fee, you can give them a 60-day no cause notice of termination with no relocation fee. But it's only for that unit. So if you have, 20 units around the state, but on your primary residence, you happen to have a guest house or something you rent out, it's just one, then you are exempt on that one. You still have to follow the law, of course, on all the others, okay? Rent increase limits. So, this part of the law didn't change anything. It was like this before, but in the first year of occupancy, you can't raise the rent at all. Once they've been there a year, you can raise the rent as often as you want. You have to give at least a 90-day notice. And the biggest change is that you're going to be capped in any 12-month period at a rent increase equal to 7% plus the year-over-year change in the West Coast Consumer Price Index. Okay? So current 2019, that total number is 10.3%. Okay? That's the most you can raise your rent in 2019. And if for some reason you're doing more than one rent increase in a year, it's the collective. So you start with what the lowest the rent was at the beginning of the year, and then wherever it happens to be now, if you did more than one rent increase, has to be less than 10.3% increase. With that said, typically you don't need to do rent increases more than just once a year, but if that was a scenario, say you bought a property, or a client did, and the seller did a 5% rent increase, earlier that year, new owner would still be able to do another 5.3% increase based off of the original rent dollar amount. So not 5.3% off of the one that's 5% higher. Does that make sense? These will be two different numbers. Okay. So the CPI, yeah.
So could this be a loophole then? Like, let's say rents are flat or declining, and you give them an increase of 8%, you're still within the limit, and then choose to move out.
Technically.
Relocation.
Yes, if say the market rent hasn't really gone up, could you still do a rent increase of say 8% or 10% or something, even though you know full well it's going at least that much above market? Absolutely you can. It's perfectly legal.
And if they leave, you don't have to pay relocation.
Correct. If a tenant gives you a notice that they are leaving, you don't owe them anything. Yeah. Let's see. So the CPI, excuse me. The changeover changes from September to September, okay? So you have to give a 90-day notice of a rent increase. If you wanted your rent increase to effectively go into effect on January 1st of a year, you would have to serve that notice basically by the beginning of October. So because of that, by the end of September every year, the state will publish what the maximum rent increase amount is the next calendar year, okay? So obviously, since this law was passed on emergency, they quickly did the math and just established 2019, it's 10.3%. The change, whatever months they chose, the change was 3.3%, so they add that to the 7% base, right? What they're gonna do every September though, is they're gonna look at, so in September 2019, coming up, they're gonna look at the West Coast Consumer Price Index amount in September of 2018, and then they're gonna subtract that from whatever the current September 2019 West Coast Consumer Price Index is. Whatever that change is the amount that gets added on to the 7% for the next calendar year, okay? So that is one thing to make sure you and or your clients know. If it's coming up on September, October, right, and your clients are talking about doing rent increases, you might be able to go on that. Well, actually not might, you can go on the U.S. Department of Labor and say, hey, you know what? Serve your rent increases now before before the end of September. So because this year it's at this, and I did the math, it's going to be at least 0.5% less if you wait till after September, because next year is gonna be a lower cap, or vice versa. Hey, client, wait just like a few weeks until we're into October, because I already did the math. Next year's rent increase cap is going to be X amount higher, and you'll be able to, get a little more out of it. So right there, if you've got someone thinking about it in September, or coming up on September, then you might want to quickly do that math and see if it might behoove them to wait a little bit, because it will change every year. Let's see.
If you've got a 1-year tenant and their renewal is in November, can you give them the notice before September?
Yeah.
If the expiration
Well, you'd
is
have
after
to.
November? Oh, okay.
Yeah, because you have to give it at least 90 days prior.
Okay.
Yeah, so you'd absolutely would. And the rent increase cap for that calendar year governs the effective date of the rent increase, not when you serve the notice. So that's why I'm saying you'll serve the notice in October, and it'll be governed by next year's cap, because 3 months later is going to be at least basically January 1st. Yes, I know technically you probably could serve it on October 1st. Come in before the end of December, and that's a whole different scenario, but bear with me. give me that one. Yeah, so that's why I'm talking about that. All that matters is what year is it on the day that the rent increase is effective.
Okay.
Yep. All right. Rent increase limits. So in between tenancies, if a tenant moves out on their own, or you do a for-cause eviction, then you can raise the rents as much as you want for when you advertise for the next tenant. Okay, there's no limits at that time. If you ask the tenant to move out at no fault of their own, whether that's through a no-cause notice in that first year, or using one of those reasons that we just went over that aren't their fault after that year, then you are still limited to your rent increase of 10.3%. So this is what I was alluding to before, where you can buy a property with the intention of renovating everything and have that be a reason, because they're going to be uninhabitable, to use to ask them to move out. But you're still going to be stuck to that 10.3% increase. Yeah, you could gamble and roll the dice, because those tenants have moved. They've probably stopped caring and looking and whatnot. But if they're friends with a neighbor that finds out, or I assume you're going to advertise these, right? They happen to be looking or whatever and see that you did too much of a rent increase from them to the next tenants, then you could have a problem. Okay? So you only get to raise it as much as you want if the tenant is evicted, they actually committed a violation and that's why they're being kicked out, or the tenant moves out on their own by giving you a notice. Okay? Which might be where that scenario over here of doing that above market rent increase of, hey, if you're gonna stick around, I need to get this to make it worth it to me. But hey, guess what, tenant, look around. You could probably get a better deal elsewhere. That might come in handy, because then they're moving out on their own accord. But if not, then you are still limited to that. So you're gonna have to, your client will have to do that math. Now, if you have a multi-unit property you're doing this to, if there's a couple tenants in there, well, actually no, because that'll be in the first year. Yeah, no, I take that back. I thought of a little piece there, but no, I didn't. Answer my own question. I was wrong. But yeah, so you will be limited to that 10.3 increase if it's not the tenant's fault or not their choosing. Let's see here. Also, if you are part of a government program that has a requirement of lower rents, then that property is exempt from rent increase limits. This does not include Section 8. They don't require you to charge a certain amount of rent. It just doesn't qualify, and you're not if your rent is too high for them, and you're not required to lower it to make it work. If you don't know what this is talking about, you definitely don't have any property or any clients with properties like this. If you do, because you saw this, it was like, well, that's one hell of a headache, and I have a whole full-time employee that deals with that whole situation, then it probably does apply. But it's those types of properties where the government chooses who does or does not live there, and the rent will fluctuate based on the tenant's income amount. And that's why they don't have the rent increase limits, because if a tenant goes from unemployed to fully employed, they're gonna see a probably infinity increase to their rent from 0 to whatever, and it would violate it, so there is an exemption for those types of properties. If you're confused about what I'm talking about, it doesn't apply to you, you don't need to know. Also, any dwelling that was given its original occupancy permit less than 15 years prior, those are exempt as well. We can talk about why later, but it's just very straightforward. If your property is less than 15 years old, then it is exempt from the rent increase limits. If you did a remodel and got a new occupancy permit, it doesn't count. It's the original occupancy permit, okay? The only way a remodel would count would be if you did the whole full demolish and then built a brand new structure ground up. Yeah. And last one, penalties. If you violate this in any way, shape, or form, it is an automatic 3 times a month's rent in fee to your tenant that you owe them. On top of any expenses, they are able to successfully argue were caused by this issue. On top of that, any legal fees as well. So, say, because the time has come and gone, you or one of your clients realized that, oh, I didn't realize the effective date of this law, and you served they served a no-cause notice to a tenant, and it expired, you know, after that deadline, so March 30th. If a tenant comes to you or that client and says, hey, I just learned about this new law, you owe me 3 months worth of rent because, and also, you know, an extra X dollar amount because I had to move and blah, 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 blah. If you go back to your numbers or your dates and you realize that you did actually make a violation, let's say it was only by 1 day, your response to that tenant should be, when and where do you want to pick up your check? You owe them that money. There is no defense. Ignorance doesn't count. There is no legitimate defense that will win unless you actually didn't violate it, okay? If you did the math and you saw that you were off by a day, or maybe you calculated your rent increase wrong and you did 10.4% instead of, you know, 10.3 or less, you ask the tenant how they want their funds and you don't argue at all. The problem is if you argue and you are in violation, you have no chance of winning here, but you decide, I've got a good excuse, I'm mad. So I'm gonna dig my heels in the sand. The next step is they talk to a lawyer if they haven't already. That lawyer is gonna write you a wonderfully threatening letter. If you've been a landlord for a while and you have not received one of these letters yet, you're not doing enough business. You need to add to your portfolio. I get probably 3 to 5 of those a year. Not ones that are legitimate. Don't get me wrong, I run a good operation just because as soon as you have a name or someone thinks you can write checks to settle lawsuits, you start getting them, right? That's what I mean by you're not doing enough business, okay? So you'll get one of those letters. I think the last one I got was, of course, conveniently timed to deliver right in between Christmas and New Year's, hoping that no one's in the office, so more time goes by and we are less likely to meet their deadlines. The last one that I got had a price tag attached of $1,500 for that lawyer to write that letter. Sometimes they'll be $500 or $1,000. $1,500 is the biggest one I've seen so far, and my most recent one, so it's fresh in my mind. So you decide to dig your heels in the sand. That's the next step. Now it's 3 times a month's rent plus the $1,500 for that lawyer. That if you still decide I just want to fight this, the moment that lawyer steps into court, their hourly fee, which you already know is heavily inflated. Well, you know, unless you're a lawyer, then, you know, of course, I'm sure you don't think you get paid enough. It typically will double, if not triple, the moment they step into court, because they can make the argument that now I'm not able to dedicate any of my time to any of my other clients. I'm 100% yours, so I cost this much more. And then you lose, and you still have to pay those fees. So if you go back to the drawing table, you realize you did accidentally violate this law, pay your tenant. Count it as hopefully the most expensive lesson that you learn as a landlord. Hopefully that's the most expensive that you do. But yeah, if you do have if you have a client that's like, hey, my landlord's trying to tell me, or my tenant's trying to tell me I own this as a relocation fee or whatever, tell them, pay it. It's cheaper than not. Okay? All right. Officially, I am done.
Hey,
Those of you who absolutely need to get out of here, feel free to go. Won't be offended. But like I said, I'll stick around and answer some questions.
Good presentation, thank you.
Thank you.
I have questions.
Okay, let's give it 30 seconds for people to clear out and stuff. And then we'll address some of that.
Not thinking, you know, about this. Let's go on my desk.
They were doing a video.
Not that I need it now, but I know.
If you guys email me, it probably sends you a PDF of it. Yeah, just pop on their website then. Yeah, I realized on there.